for our panel. The moderator for this panel is Graciela Speranza, professor of Argentine literature at the Universidad de Buenos Aires. She has published several books of conversations on art and literature, as well as a novel, and has also written documentary and feature film scripts. She is a literary art and film critic, co-editor of the Arts and Letters journal Obra Parte, and a Guggenheim Fellow since 2002.
No.
Now, yes.
Now?
Now, yes?
Now
Yes?
it's okay?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here with Andrea from Argentina and Matías from neighboring Chile. And this is the first time I have the chance to talk, so I could like to take the opportunity to thank the Getty for the organization of this project and all the people from the Getty for the help in the research during this more than a year. And thank, of course, Rita Eder for the invitation to participate in this project, and Rita and Dawn for their inexhaustible enthusiasm in discussing, rethinking Latin American art. And I also want to say that I'm very pleased to have a Spanish-English hybrid title for this symposium and to have Julio Cortázar alive again in the title. Well, and going further in this debate, I think that both you, Matías and Andrea, you have focused or you have interest in poets and works and magazines from the 70s or the 60s, long after the first declaredly surrealist movements appear in Argentina, that, as you said, appear in 1928 and a bit later in Chile. So I was wondering if these movements, poets in your case, had links with these first movements, or they have new, fresh connections with, in the case of the Chilean poets, perhaps with Dada and Duchamp, and in the case of Arte Destructivo or Boa Faces, new relinks with other artists in Europe or in Latin America.
Well, first of all, K magazine had never included images. The two issues are this kind of compact print, you know, with text, and any image. And that's why I said that you can compare or you can analyze the surrealist movement in terms of images in Argentina from a chronological point of view with the development of this European surrealism. It was a kind of experiment on surrealism without images. Then the first images were created by the group. It were the ones that Antonio Berni brought from Paris in 1933, and also the genealogy that Pellegrini created, saying that Jules Solar was the first surrealist before the surrealism. Then it is a genealogy created by Pellegrini of images, but not a group that recognized themselves as surrealist. Mm-hmm. And when it happened, that was, well, 1939 with the Orion group, which was more this kind of imagery connected with Dali or Magritte, in a way, they represent the idea of the space they were dealing with. But the moment when a group of artists identify themselves in a way with something that we can call a surrealist formation, connected in some way with the international movement, was after World War II with Voa Faces. Even if Pellegrini operated this connection between abstraction and surrealism before, in 1948, with Ciclo. And the 60s is more as it was in the States, no? This neo-Dadaism, but they were not referring themselves as neo-Dadaists, because
Arte destructivo, you mean?
yeah, they said, well, we can be accused of copying the Dada or Surrealist movement. They saw themselves as, they didn't look at themselves as doing something new at the beginning. This is interesting, no? But at the same time, in New York was happening the exhibition, The Art of Assemblage, that for the genealogy of the 60s is a departing point in terms of avant-garde. Then it's interesting to compare what was happening in both spaces, because it was almost the same. Arte Destruction in Art was in 1961. They didn't saw themselves as avant-garde artists, but they were really, with some other artists working in different explorations, the beginning of the avant-garde in the 60s.
And in Chile?
Well, it's funny because all of the poets that I talked today, none of them make a relation to the Chilean surrealist group La Mandrágora, which were working in the 40s and 50s. And I talk about the surrealist features in them. La Mandrágora is like a very special group because they try to be like a real branch of surrealism in Chile. So they try to be like a pure surrealist. And they did not try to mix that with, like I said in the start of my presentation, with a cultural discourse or with a political project. It's like they try to be a pure surrealist. But I think the literary influence of surrealism in Latin America is always related to this sort of romantic subjectivity, as we have seen in Moro romantic poetry, what we saw yesterday. So they didn't have a very, Mandrágora in Chile didn't have a very wide influence. What happens in the 50s, Nicanor Parra published a book, Poemas Antipoemas, against La Mandrágora, and he turns out to be the key figure in the poetry in the second half of the 20th century in Chile. So it's like all the important poetry of Chile in the second half acts against La Mandrágora. There's one special history about this. Braulio Arenas, one of the important figures in La Mandrágora, reviewed La Nueva Novela of Juan y Martínez very badly. He didn't understand anything. Yeah, he didn't understand anything. It's amazing. Well, Braulio Arenas ends his life very conservative. He was the director of the Biblioteca Nacional under Pinochet. And Braulio Arenas said in his review that there's one place that Martínez copies Aragon, and he said, well, this is just a copy of surrealism. And he was not reading anything. It's like, I don't know, saying that Martínez was writing, like we say, like Borgiano paradigm. So the idea of copy and the original is other. And Arenas didn't understand anything. So this kind of separation of all these poets from La Mandrágora.
So you think there are new connections, through the surrealists in Chile?
Yeah. No, through the like the established surrealists. There's other kind of connections.
And there was a very ironical rewriting of Neruda in the case of Claudio Bertoni. How could you place Neruda in all this surrealist discussion?
Neruda has a special place because he has like a surrealist moment in famous Les Residencias en la Tierra, one of the most important poetry book of avant-garde in Latin America, but he left it as Eluard going to political commitment. So the comeback from Bertoni is like just like ironical. Bertoni doesn't share much with Neruda, although both are really autobiographical poets, but the kind of subjectivity that each one constructs are very different.
I have another question or comment for Andrea. I think that the case of Leo Ferrari that you bring is very interesting in these new accounts, as you showed, of Latin American or Argentine art made from outside. Because as you said, Ferrari never considered himself a conceptualist. And but he seems to be instrumental to these new narratives of Argentine modernization, devoid of the surrealist connection. Is that so?
Well, yeah, probably. When he did written painting, even if conceptualism was happening at this time, it was not, he was not working through these connections. Really, I find that it was more important, the edition of the book of Pellegrini in 1961, and he was looking more at surrealist images. Then it was instrumental because it's a way, it is a conceptual work. He writes, if I was a painter and I was able to paint, the painting I will do will be this and this, just I need that God give me the inspiration, which is something that didn't happen. Then he's not a painter. This is whatever he's playing in the story. But then it is a conceptual work, and it's good to say, well, conceptualism was created at the same time or even before in Latin America. I don't have any problem with that. I am comfortable with saying that we created everything before, but it is not exactly the case. And what I am proposing is that the same genealogies that were built from the point of view of abstraction and conceptualism could be rewritten from the point of view of surrealism. Why not? Then the question is, why not?
And a more complex
to
genealogy.
Make things more complex and in some way more connected with the specific historical formations,
yeah,
no?
peculiar
And not with
to
the projection
Argentina.
of ideas. Because really, you have to think that even if Ferrari never represented himself as a part of the surrealist movement, he was classified by Pellegrini as a surrealist very early, and he was in touch with the world of writers and receiving letters from Cortázar also. Then it is possible, why not, to think again Ferrari from surrealism.
Thank you. Well, perhaps we could open questions to the audience. Here, please. Wait a minute for the microphone, please.
I have a question from Matías Ayala. I just want to raise the name of two friends of mine who are Chilean surrealists, and they're living in Mexico. I'm thinking of Ludwig Zeller and Susanna Wald. Do you know them? Do you know their work? Because they have an amazing long history connecting to the European surrealists.
Yeah, they're kind of eccentric figures in Chile. Both don't live in Chile. Zeller...
They're in Oaxaca now.
Okay, yes. Zeller has made drawings for a lot of books. I have one of Díaz Casanueva, for example, very beautiful. But, yeah, but I don't know what is the relation of them to La Mandragua. Do you know? I think it's like kind of loose relation. It's not like...
Now they're going back to Chile for their book launchings and things, but they were in Canada for such a long time.
I think that maybe, yes, they're in the surrealist way, but they're not related to this like official surrealism. So probably one can say that...
More to the French. They would correspond daily, like 3 times a day. They would be sending out art objects and all kinds of letters and things for years. This is way back in the 70s. And then they moved to Canada. Anyway, there's a treasure trove in Oaxaca now.
Good.
Okay, there.
Hi. I think think I have a quick question for both of you. The young woman, when you mentioned, I thought was a movement, Faces. Is that correct?
What?
We
No,
cannot
didn't
hear
get
from
it.
here. We cannot hear very well.
FACES, perhaps? FAS. What is that?
What?
Faces.
Faces.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh,
All right.
okay.
I got it. Okay. And then a question for the gentleman. When you said that someone had a surrealism moment, and you said we use that
Neruda, Neruda.
to mean what? That the guy himself knew he was being surrealistic, or we're deciding that now?
Okay.
Okay, Faces was the reorganization of surrealism in the 50s by Edouard Jaguar, who was part of the surrealist movement. And he relaunched surrealism through a magazine, which I showed the cover, that it's from, I think that it has to be understood in a constellation of magazines that were published together. The operation was to make an exhibition together with the magazine and to establish a kind of international experimental net through magazines. Then it were very connected magazines with exhibitions and artists collaborating in different, on many of these different magazines. And this is after World War II, no? Then to reframe the international of surrealism, but in a new aesthetic way, or new aesthetic way of representing painting.
Okay.
Wait.
Trills by César Vallejo y Residencia en la Tierra by Neruda are the most important books from avant-garde poetry. They are inconceivable without surrealism. But no critic says that this is just a surrealist book. No one. So it's like surrealism is necessary for them, but not only that.
Like the case of César Vallejo, we could say.
Yeah.
I was actually wondering, thinking of the close relationship or link that there was during the time of the abstract geometry, in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, with Art de Concreto, and the group of Madi that happened in Uruguay. As you were talking, Andrea, about this kind of relationship with this kind of hard abstraction and these other ideas, was there any exchange and development in, for example, Uruguay and Brazil in the same way that in Argentina developed this kind of surrealist critical trend of his own, in the same way that there was this kind of a compilation of moments in the kind of the abstract arena between Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, being all this kind of neighboring country, that there was exchange between all these places?
Well, there are different horizons overlapped, at the same time, because it's not a clausuration of a tradition. Then it was very strong, the tradition of the School of the South and all the Torres Garcia school that create a horizon of connections in terms of abstraction between Argentina and Uruguay. On the other side, you have Arturo magazine, that was a magazine where participated Argentinians, Uruguayans, and Brazilians. Then you have these moments of connection. But in this moment, you have to think about new relationships, and it's, in one way, Faces had a Brazilian own movement. It is a special group of artists, which I didn't work specifically on them, but I know that they have their own Faces movement in Brazil. And I don't know if in Uruguay there is something equivalent in the 50s. Yeah, I don't know. And from the point of view of their abstraction, of course, it's a moment of negotiation between the hard abstraction of the first concrete artist, whose aesthetic was dilute in a way and able to stay in the same exhibition space with some other kind of abstraction, more emotional abstraction, which was not the original proposal, but was never it was never a fusion between the two aesthetics. They were coexisting in same space exhibitions, but not creating a new formulation for abstraction. No, it was more an operation of Pellegrini. Then, I don't know if I answer all your question.
Okay.
A question from Matías. Can you please elaborate on this connection between pause visualization, that's the technique that he used. He did not have any control about the framing and maybe select the photographs after they were developed, and poetic writing. How this connection between having control over the subject but not of the framing, and then looking at the images and writing, how those three elements play together, please.
Mm-hmm. I don't really know what does Bertoni after they take the picture, how they went. I don't know the story. I will have to ask him. And between the photographs and the poetry, there's a lot of relationships. One of his books is called Jóvenes Buenas Mozas, which in English will be like pretty young girls, something like that. Right? And it's all about all of these young girls he found in the street and wrote these like very fast poems. But I don't know if that really answers your question.
Where? Okay.
I'm having a senior moment. He's a Mexican photographer, Pedro Mayer. I just got him. Pedro Mayer, who is one of a world photographer at this point. He has had exhibits around the world. Pedro Mayer. He began photography in ultra-realism. He began as a journalist almost. In his later years, he's gone past reality and gone into what you could, by looking at the images, say surreal, where he begins to create reality. And his work and his new manifestation, new creative manifestation, also depends on the technology. So there's surrealism, though it began in the pre-Xerox age, when the most we could do was cut out things and paste them on one another. There's now a new technology which fosters what some say is photographic lying and others say is surrealism. But in Mexico, there seems to be, with Manuel Alvarez Bravo, with his realism, it almost goes beyond the imagery. They're echoes, philosophic echoes. I would like to have you comment on that to some degree.
Well, I always say when I teach surrealism, I always say to my students, if the first surrealists have seen MTV, they will be delighted, because it's like their dream come true. Like all these images that doesn't make anything, and they're very beautiful. But probably you have a more academic response.
No, I don't have an academic. It was an exercise for me also, because when I affirmed that the canon of abstraction and conceptualism is installed in the academy, is because I am part of that, you know. I directed to a PhD made on abstraction, but not on surrealism. Then it's an exercise for me also to think again genealogies and to think again. And I think that we have to take care to go again into these cliches to say everything is surrealist and everything could be thought from a surrealist point of view, because then it are not limits, and well, this is not the point. But there are many artists that are in Argentina, for example, in these last years, when after the crisis, collectives were organized. For example, the Etcétera Colectivo was, yeah?
Yeah, we have to finish. we have to finish,
start.
I think.
just to say that was installed in the Juan Andralis printer, and then they continued themselves the spirit of surrealism, but in the streets.
Well, thank you all. Muy bien.